It is the 24th of October, and this day in Baptist history, our reading is Only God is the Judge. Our verse comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 1. Let a man so account of us as of the ministers of Christ and stewards of the mystery of God. On this date in 1840, Adoniram Judson placed the last sheet of the completed Bible manuscript into the hands of the printer, and the wonderful Burman translation of the life-transforming book was complete. The miracle of that translation is a story all in itself. However, a little-known co-laborer deserves more recognition than history has provided. I invite you to share this background of Reverend and Mrs. George Hough of today, H-O-U-G-H. Inasmuch as the Hughes left the field before the entire process was completed, Reverend Hough has become the recipient of much censure. Perhaps the complete story will bring into sharper focus the trials of those early days. I quote, Reverend George H. Hough and Mrs. Phoebe M. Hough had been appointed by the board missionaries to Burma in the summer of 1815. Mr. Hough had been bred a printer and had worked at the trade in the United States. They sailed from Philadelphia in the following December and arrived in Calcutta in April 1816. On the 15th of October 1816, Mr. and Mrs. Hough arrived at Rangoon, having already sent before them a printing press and a font of Burman types, which had been presented to the mission by their English brethren at Serampore, India. Here they were welcomed by Mr. and Mrs. Judson with more than common delight, both as fellow laborers in carrying forward the mission and as messengers from the distant but unforgotten land of their birth and their affections. The Judsons had been exiled for 3 years from civilized society, dwelling amid the rude barbarities of the heathen, and now to receive to their secluded home intelligent associates and Christian countrymen and friends was a source of joy and thankfulness, such as can be fully appreciated only by those who have been placed in similar circumstances. End of quote. Judson had made little progress in gaining command of the Burman language, but he had written the language well enough in hand to begin writing tracts. So it was that Hough could begin early to make the message available in print. I quote, "The scattering of the message of salvation required haste, and even before Hough could read Burmese, he began his printing. The heat of Rangoon was suffocating. Perspiration blurred his vision, ran off his beard, and stained his copy as he stood there comparing the curious type with the crazy chicken tract manuscript. His only assistants were a couple of half-naked Burmans, and all the help they could provide was to twist tighter the hand press. Yet Hough succeeded in printing the first edition of what was to become a classic for tracts, and to run to 40 editions over the century. The tract, called The Golden Balance, had been written by Judson. Mr. Hough, though he could not speak the Burmese language, set the type." End of quote. The fact that Judson had been unable to master the spoken language caused him to propose a trip to Chittagong, Arakan, to secure Christian converts to assist him, since the dialect used there was similar to that of the Burmans. Mrs. Judson was left with the Hughs, and Judson expected to return within 3 months. At the end of that time, the startling message was received that he had never reached that port. Simultaneously, the friendly local political figure who had been such a help to the Judsons had been replaced, and the new official was totally unsympathetic. Mr. Hough was called before the new official, who, by threats, endeavored to extort bribes for toleration and protection. Furthermore, threatenings of war between Burma and England became ominous. The British businessmen all left, but Mrs. Judson was adamant that she must remain until her husband returned. Faithfully, the Hughs remained with her, as the last foreign vessel left the harbor. In time, Judson returned and reported that he had been unable to reach his destination. With worsening conditions, the Hughes eventually sailed for Calcutta. Matters seemed to quiet on the field, and new recruits were added to assist the Judsons. The Hughes had remained in Calcutta, providing their own support, but in January 1822 they returned and reassumed their labors with the Judsons. When Adoniram Judson left Rangoon to begin the work in the capital of Ava, he left the work in the hands of Reverend Hugh and Reverend Jonathan Wade. On May 10, 1824, what is called the First Burman War began between the Burmese and the British. The account of that ordeal for the Hughes and Wades followed, and I quote, "The two missionary companions of Mr. Judson, Wade and Hugh, escaped with their lives by a miracle. The orders had been given for their execution. The executioners had sharpened their knives and strewn the floor with sand to receive the blood of the missionaries. The prisoners with bared necks had knelt to receive the blow when a broadside from the English war vessels so frightened the executioners that they threw down their knives and fled. Meanwhile, the wives of the heroic men escaped, disguised as Burmese servants. The British troops sent both couples to Calcutta, India, for safekeeping." End of quote. The Judsons, along with Dr. Jonathan Price, a medical missionary, were in Ava at this time. For the next 2 years, the men were in prison, sustained primarily by the care given them by dear Ann Judson. At the conclusion of the conflict, Dr. Judson was called upon by the British to act as an interpreter to the embassy, charged with negotiating a peace treaty. While the negotiations were taking place and Dr. Judson was away, Mrs. Judson died alone on October 24, 1826. Of that period, Dr. Judson wrote, and I quote, "We survived a scene of suffering, which seems not a reality, but a horrid dream." End of quote. Reverend Hugh and Dr. Price both retired from the missionary service. It is easy from our vantage point of ease and comfort, to condemn either or both men for retiring. However, we would do well to judge nothing before the time, until the Lord come, and then shall every man have praise of God. To God be the glory.